What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to Resilience Builds. My name is Jake. Today, we're taking a look on how to install Knocksense onto your vehicle. So welcome to the Boost Barn, Project Barn, whatever. This is just where I keep cars so I can do work on them. And if you're wondering what the vehicle in the back is, stick around for some future videos. I'm going to be jumping into depth into my uncle's Project Stereon / Dodge Conquest that we got here in the background. Wanted to thank everybody for continuing to watch. The channel's been slowly growing, and that is thanks to you guys. I want to apologize for taking such a long time to get this video out. We recently just had our daughter, which we are so glad to introduce her into the world. And then we got COVID. And so we've been healing for about the past month, just getting back from this crazy COVID stuff. And I'm finally in a place where I feel like I can record well and get you guys important information that you need, like for this video. So let's continue. Some of the things you're going to need to install the Knocksense into your vehicle, and I'm going to be taking a more universal approach, and then I'll be addressing my Volvo buddies here shortly, is an assortment of screwdrivers is going to be helpful. You could be using this just to be pulling apart the interior and to get into different screws so you can like get under the kick panel and ultimately route the correct wiring into the Knocksense if you're going to be having that in the cabin, which I would tell you to do that, and that's also in the instructions of the Knocksense. Zip ties are going to be helpful here. Some basic electrical equipment for stripping and a different assortment of connectors could be helpful in your application. I needed a timing light in order to set the base timing of my vehicle and to ultimately mess around and tune with the distributor to advance my timing to get a better responding vehicle, which is the whole reason I got the Knocksense, as well as just a safeguard for future tuning. Alrighty, so now jumping into it. Next up, you guys are going to be seeing the installation process that I had on old Von Burgundy, and then you'll come back and I'll start talking to you guys about tuning. Alright, so the first thing we're taking a look at is down here where the knock sensor ultimately is. You will see it way back over here. Oh, my hand is not helping anyone. There we go. So just under that upper sensor that you're seeing going into the head there, I believe that's for the coolant temperature. Just under that is where the knock sensor is located. Then following those wires, you're going to see that it ultimately connects back to the harness, and that's going to send the signal, the knock signal, back to the ECU to retard timing. But what we are also interested in from a tuning aspect is the black wire that's running across the idle control as well. So we follow this black wire. This is ultimately what's going to send the signal to our light on the dash. And I have it running right through here, in through the firewall. Not the cleanest work. This was just to get it set up and working. You can see got power going to the Knocksense straight from the battery. So coming here, got this taken out. So this is currently set up so that I can just quickly pull it. So I can just quickly pull it and mess with the pot there. So this actually doesn't rattle or anything for me, but you can see it is a true mess. This is not final install. You can see how it is ultimately set up into those gates. So you just pull up on each one of those gates and then let them come crunching down on the wires there. And then on the flip side, you can take out those screws. I'd already had the screws set in there mainly because I'm already done adjusting them. And for now, while I'm still adjusting, I keep it right here in this tunnel under the steering column. I decided to put the light right here, ultimately. One, because I had an extra bezel and I thought it looked really clean. It is not necessarily in the best place for tuning, so unless at nighttime, it is quite a bright LED, but unless you are working on it at nighttime from a tuning aspect, you're not going to really see it flash in the daylight. So the manufacturer of Knocksense actually has you put it up here in the dash actually. So I'll show you guys exactly kind of what it feels like in here having it. So you can see it's located down there, not in the optimum spot for tuning, It is supposed to be anywhere from like right there or right over here. Right over here next to that turbo gauge there. That would be the most helpful spot for installing. Other portions I was thinking about putting is I have my boost gauge down over here, is maybe putting it right in the center of this bezel. But next I'll show you guys it. Next I will show you guys it working. So it actually will pick up the frequency coming from the crank. It just does it for a quick moment. All right, so now to address the Volvo nerds that follow on this channel. So what you're gonna notice is on Von Burgundy, that's an LH 2.2 system. That is ultimately describing the older fuel system that was on cars from about 1985 to 1989 on all those Volvos with the B230s. So the LH 2.2 in this case is gonna be advantageous because it's gonna allow us to mess around with the base timing and affect the ignition timing curve, and that's exactly why I have the Knocksense installed in this case. Because with the Knocksense, I'm able to tweak that timing slightly to get ultimately better response down low, to help boost spool more quickly, and to get better throttle response. So those three main things is how we're able to do this old school form of tuning because we haven't gone standalone yet. So by adjusting our timing, static timing, at idle, it's going to affect overall the ignition timing across the entire curve because these are just really archaic systems. But if you have LH 2.4, which is a newer system that was used 1990 onward on these B230s, that would be your 740, your 940, and the sedan wagon variant, you're not going to get as much control just moving that distributor there on the back of the head. You guys have some other advantages though, because LH 2.4, you have your ignition and timing is talking to each other. You guys can ultimately have chips made that, as you affect the fuel side, you also have the ability to mess around and map your ignition. So there's pros and cons to the LH 2.2 and 2.4 systems that we won't go into here, but ultimately, if you are buying this hoping you can just change up the distributor on the back of the head and you have a 1990 plus Volvo, that LH 2.4 system is not going to be doing you any favors. If you have an older system, you are going to see that we are going to be able to actually tweak it a little bit and gain a small amount of performance, which for around $100 and a timing light, just to be able to tweak your distributor slightly and to be able to safely advance your timing on an old car like this, that's a really cheap mod, and that's exactly why we're doing it. All right, so now let's talk about, after we've installed the Knocksense, how we set it up and begin to both safeguard and to help us tune, whether we are doing the old school method tuning that I'm doing or using it for, say, a standalone. So what you're going to notice, you have your Knocksense all set up and you have that dash pot kind of set to about 30 degrees. What you're going to need to do then is to actually induce some knock. So the two ways to do this, and neither are technically safe, but you can either throw in some really crummy fuel, and that's going to allow you to produce knock early into the boost. And with that, that was one sketchy way to do it, and that you don't really have to mess with the distributor on the back of the head to advance the ignition to such a point that you begin to have pre-ignition or knock. What you could do, which is my route that I ultimately did, was I took the distributor on the back and just moved it all the way, if you're looking right down the car, and then I moved it counterclockwise all the way, and I just loosened the two 10mm bolts holding the distributor to the back of the cylinder head. Now what this did was just give crazy amounts of static advance to the engine, and so that what ultimately was happening is I was advancing the timing to such a degree that low down into the power band, if I could be on the highway, I could ultimately give a slight amount of knock at about 3 pounds, 3 to 5 pounds of boost at 2800 RPM, which was audible, that you could actually hear, which I was lucky that somehow I was able to hear that over the road noise. But I was able to induce knock at a low RPM and a lower load than, say, just throwing in crappy fuel, having to get higher up into the power range and build more of a load onto the engine in order to induce knock. So once you can actually hear knock audibly being made from the engine, you then want to see wherever you located. Now, in my case, I had to do this at night so that I could see the flashing light. You got to notice when the light turns on in the vehicle and to make sure that it is lighting up with the audible knock. If it's not, then you need to adjust the dash pot inside the Knocksense to be a little less sensitive. If it's lighting up easily, like you're picking it up before that there's audible knock, or really before there's audible knock, or you're picking up other signals. Like one example is whenever my starter would go off to start the vehicle, that would get picked up. And I'm going to tackle that in the final thoughts here shortly. So ultimately, that's what you need to do. You need to induce knock safely into the vehicle. Look at your Knocksense light that you ultimately have wired up, and make sure that those are being timed together so that you know, okay, and I hear audible knock, or because you're not going to be able to hear that typically while you're driving. When I have audible knock, it's being picked up, and it's actually, you're going to adjust it slightly before that so that you can hear non-audible knock, which is really important when you're ultimately tuning. So we've set up our Knocksense, we've set up its ability to pick up audible and non-audible knock, just the entire point we install this thing. Now let's talk about some of the tuning benefits of having Knocksense and some other comments that I had in my roughly 4 months of owning this Knocksense inside of Von Burgundy. So as we're able to dial in our ignition tuning on our vehicles, what that ultimately is going to do is going to give you a handful of benefits. One, it's going to give you better throttle response, which always feels better, especially if you have a turbocharged application. You want that car to have as best response as possible, because inherently that turbo is going to cause some issues with the transient response. So you'll notice with like a supercharged or naturally aspirated vehicle, the throttle response is typically really awesome depending on how that air is being induced into the engine. With a turbocharged, no matter what you're adding it to, it's always going to lag in some way or cause a slower it's going to have a slow transient response, meaning when the minute you put your foot down, that amount of time for you to feel the power response is ultimately its transient response. So ultimately, we're going to get better pedal feel, we're going to get more torque down low, which is also going to give you that sense of more pep in the step of the vehicle. It's going to be easier to drive, way better around town, and you're also going to get better fuel economy. So you can have too much advanced down low though, and what that is going to ultimately cause is going to suffer, performance is going to suffer. And so you need to balance with ignition two things, which is just too little, too much, just right. And typically in the tuning world, you're going to notice that this is just tuning for torque. You want the best torque at any point along the torque curve. And the two things that you get to ultimately get the best power or torque anywhere along the torque curve, because that's all that power is just a function of torque over time, is by tuning in as well as we can the fueling and then the ignition. So the fueling you handle on a different day, but today why we need the Knocksense is ultimately on a gasoline vehicle. If we keep advancing too much, unlike with something like E85 or methanol injection, where that's going to really up our knock threshold, but even on something like super unleaded fuel, you will ultimately run into pre-ignition if you keep adding so much timing that it's going to light that air fuel bomb being compressed too early. And so you can have too much ignition, and that will ultimately cause your performance to suffer because you've lit off that air fuel bomb that's being compressed too early, and torque is going to suffer, thus power is going to suffer anywhere along the power curve. So what we're trying to do is dial in the ignition so that we get the maximum amount of torque at that RPM in our RPM range. So final thoughts on the Knocksense. For $100 or less, Knocksense is an awesome and simple, easy thing to install into your vehicle that will help in the tuning process. And no matter the tuning process that you're doing, and in our case, we're just on old Von Burgundy doing a really old school, 80s level tuning, where we're working with like EEPROM chips. We are just tweaking the ignition the best we can given the tools that we have. But it will benefit us as we look to go standalone one day, and we are trying to learn how do we mess around with the timing to get the max amount of torque in any specific location along the torque curve. So Knocksense is awesome because it can help all the way at the bottom level of tuning where we're just messing with the distributor, and it will benefit us all the way up to the highest levels of tuning where we're starting to go standalone ECU and then CAN bus, and we'll eventually get there one day. Not gonna be able to do that on Von Burgundy. And so Knocksense is nice because it's a cheap intro level way to just immediately start tuning your vehicle and have it benefit you all the way up to some of the highest levels of tuning. And your tuner will also love you because he'll not have to worry, or he or she will not have to worry about having to listen for knocks on some headphones or some other diagnostic equipment. You'll have your Knocksense located somewhere better than I initially installed it, and you'll be able to see it flash when knock is an issue, and they'll then get off the throttle and hopefully save your engine before you have any other tuning disasters. So Knocksense is cheap, it's easy to install, it has long-term benefits in terms of tuning. The only issues I was having is that because it's utilizing equipment that is on the vehicle, it is also susceptible to any issues you'll have inherent with the vehicle. So in my case, Knocksense was installed and I was never able to really dial out using that little dash pot adjuster the startup crank frequency that would happen every time I turn on the car. So I would see the little red flash every time I started up the vehicle. Now that didn't bother me too much. If anything, it kind of made it seem like, oh, I know it's on and I know it's working. I never had any battery drain or any issues there. So thumbs up to Knocksense from Viatrack. It just doesn't put enough of an electrical load onto the system to really draw it out. And in my case, where I was driving it every other day, never had any issues there of killing the battery. So thank you guys for watching. What do you guys think? Is this something where you want to put $100? I think it was worth it. It's a cool, easy little thing to install that nobody else really has and is going to benefit us long-term in the tuning community. Be sure to check out the previous video somewhere up here if you haven't seen the product review. This has been the technical talk and the installation video. We will see you guys later.